second half baseball betting, handicapping tips. Marco, what should a bettor be looking at in the second half of baseball different than the first?
Well, it's not really different than in the first, RJ. What it is that...
So we should just get the video we did before the season started and replay it.
Now, what I'm going to point out is there's different things to look at, and we're still, baseball, the beauty of baseball, unlike the other, every sport, they're stat-based, but baseball is the most statistical-based sport to handicap of any of the three major sports. But what happens is we move further into the season, the numbers become purer. You're a guy, you break down numbers all the time. You know when you're working with 30 days of numbers, there's big swings based on performance. A guy can go out and pitch a good game and his ERA in the early season can jump a whole run, where now everything's coming to the norm, they're true numbers, and that, to me, it makes baseball easier as you get through July, August. Now, where you'll get a twist later in the season is once we get to that magical September 1st, when teams will expand the rosters.
So why don't we plan on doing a video and the call-ups and the motivation issues? We'll do a late season baseball video most likely. Let's talk about the whole point of sample size. So if we're talking statistics, really we're talking sample size.
Okay.
In an NFL season, there's 16 regular season games. Halfway through a baseball season, which we're a little past the halfway mark now, there are what, 81 games?
Correct.
So literally it would be 16, 32, 48, all the way out. You got multiple NFL seasons equal a half of a baseball season.
Absolutely.
So it makes a ton of sense that if you're a statistics guy, 16 games into the baseball season, you have as many games as the last game of the NFL regular season, and now many more games to consider. You also made an interesting point, though, is if you're looking at the pitching side of baseball, those pitchers are only pitching, what is it, even if they stay healthy and they're a number one starter, 35, 38 games a year typically, in that range. So though that's more than even a full NFL season, it's still much less than 162 games. So you've got a ton of games for the team. You've got less games for the individual pitchers.
Correct.
Right.
But you've also got, again, the pitcher is probably 70 to 80% of your handicapping, the starting pitcher. But
For you?
For me.
I've heard people say 50-50.
It's changing less and less every year, I'll agree, as more managers go to almost the cookie cutter approach to baseball managing. You get that guy, give you 6 innings, you go to the setup guy in the 7th, the middle, the setup to the closer in the 8th, and then the closer in the 9th. And
But that's an interesting point, because you're saying, and I agree with you, the trend is away from the significance of the starting pitching because he's pitching less innings typically, though there's exceptions to that. But it sounds like you, in general, look at the starting pitching more than than the average handicapper does. Because I'd say the average handicapper is much closer to 50-50 than 80%. So what is it about that approach that appeals to you?
Well, because you're still looking at 2/3 of the game is going to be that starting pitcher unless he's totally bad.
But in theory, he's only half of the game.
Well, if he gets
he's half of that 2/3. And then the bullpen's going to be half of the final third, where there's a top half of the inning and a bottom half of the inning.
But it centers around him. My goal is when I'm looking at pitchers, I handicap a game. I want a pitcher that I feel is going to go out that day and can hold the other team to 3 runs or less and turn it over to the bullpen. If my pitcher is able to do that, it puts my team in a position to win, because obviously there's 2 pitchers that you're handicapping. One you think's going to hold the team to 3 runs or less, and the other pitcher you're thinking's not going to hold them to 3 runs or less. So, that's where you're at. And if I get that mathematical edge, and we're looking at price, and I can't belabor the point in baseball that if you're playing all big favorites, you're going to get yourself into trouble. My motto, and some people do it, everybody has their own style, but my motto is, you play underdogs and small favorites, and that's the key to success in baseball, in my opinion.
Now, last year you had, and this is another point we won't belabor, but you had a historic run in baseball. You won 25 straight documented games, not sides, not totals, all games, never laid more than 120, and more than half the games were underdogs. We did the math. It was like 42 million to 1 for that to happen randomly. So, Marco, you are not random. I want you to know that.
Well, thank you.
That said, your first half of the year has been about break even. What is it? Is it typically you like the second half better, and if so, why?
Well, June started picking it up, and typically the month of April is the slowest month for me because just what we talked about, the data. The data is just so raw, and it's up and down because there's swings because of the sample size. The beauty is, and technically I'm 2 games under 500. As we're talking today, we're taping on Friday. I'm 2 games under 500 for the season. I'm literally minus a half a unit on the year. Again, stressing the importance of the underdogs, where that keeps you in the game.
We'll just talk about that real quick. Is if you're laying 110 on point spreads, you got to win 52.38% to break even. And the nice thing about baseball is if you shop around, you can get a dime line, which means it's half as much juice as a minus 110, minus 110. And like you said, you can play a lot of dogs. So it's important, or you can play as many dogs as you want. So, and you believe the value's on the dogs, which I think is typically true. The public likes to bet favorites, run lines, favorites on the run line. So really what I think the message here is, it isn't about win percentage. It's about net profit, and that's going to come from not only picking more winners and losers, but really that's not even the point. It's going to be that when you take those plus dogs, you're winning at a high enough percentage.
Just in its simplest form, obviously, say you're 50%, 70 and 70, and you're betting $100 on each game. Obviously, at even money, you broke even. At just 140, which is not, way out there, that same 70 and 70 record, you would be minus $2,800 just because of the juice.
All right. So I like, if I'm looking for a handicapper to follow, a guy that's playing more dogs and favorites, I like. So what else is it about the second half?
Well, the other thing that you've got is you're going to have situations, and I'm a big situational handicapper. Teams, I feel, develop characteristics, and we're going to break down a couple teams to watch for the second half and some other videos that they're Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. They excel in one situation, but they're just horrible in another or very good in another, and then you can isolate. What the general public does too often is they just look at raw numbers. They'll look at a starting pitcher and see an ERA. Okay, this guy's got an ERA of 3.5, but he may be 2-point-something in the daylight and 4-something at night, but you're paying for that name of that pitcher.
I knew this girl once. She was a 6 in the daytime, 8 at night.
8 at night with the beer goggles. Did you have the good beer goggles?
That was a whole different thing. Go ahead.
All right. They always get prettier at 1:45. Back in PA, the bars closed at 2. Out here, when do they get prettier? Because the bars never close.
Go ahead.
All right. So those are situations, and again, the deeper you go into a season, the easier it is to see these characteristics of teams.
So let's talk about that. It's a great point, and actually one I had never explicitly thought about. I don't believe in team trends in football or even in basketball, but more so in basketball, less in football even, within a season. So if you tell me that USC in college football is 6-2 on grass or whatever, all the trends you see that is spit out by the computer, there's nothing, even 6-0 is not statistically significant. But in baseball, because you do have 162 games, now the thing about football is you can say, well, USC as a dog is 28-2 the last 20 years. Now the question is how applicable, 28-2 is a great record, but how applicable is, John Robinson's USC team from, 85 or whatever. Right. Now, I do believe, just as a caveat, that there can be cultural things about a team where, and again, we'll see now with Tressel gone, but Ohio State, the whole time he was there, was always a tough underdog. And, there's all these different ways that Lou Holtz had a certain, coaches, I think, can put their culture upon a team throughout multiple seasons, but that's only a certain type of coach and a certain type of effect they can have. And to me, in general, team trends are very dangerous for football. In baseball, once you get to game 120, 130, 140, things like day, night, and all that, it can get statistically significant.
Especially whenever, if you've got a trend that's 2 years and it's holding this year and it held last year, that's significant. If a team struggles
you're going to look at turnover.
Yeah.
Or when I say turnover, I mean turnover of the player.
Right. But from 1 year to the next, it's not as severe as like when you're talking in college football where you've always got a graduating class. So it's just a numbers-based sport, and I love that.
If there's 324 games over 2 years, if you think about that, if there is an extension at least 1 year forward, let's say to a 90% degree, let's say that you can't look at the numbers from 2 years ago quite the same, but you potentially are past 300 games as a sample size with a team with a decent amount of continuity.
Absolutely.
Any closing thoughts?
And just, be smart as you always do with baseball. Don't get into the luxury late in the season. When we get into August, the teams that are rising to the top, they're going to be 200 favorites most of the time. Your Yankees and so forth. Don't get caught into that. People say, you'll hear the adage, I only worry about the line if I lose in baseball.
Well, that's just not. Those people aren't winning.
They're not, but you'll be surprised how many times you hear people say that.
And I know, and they have a straight job, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
All right. It's your turn to continue the conversation in the comment section with Marco and me. And next up, we're going to talk about a few individual teams. Marco being Mr. Pittsburgh, we're going to be doing a video on the Pirates, amazing but true. And then we're going to do a video on the Yankees because we know there's a lot of fans and haters out there. And remember, you can get all of our videos at pregame.tv.